In the gleaming heart of Manhattan's financial district, Henry Mitchell stood at his corner office window on the 47th floor. Below him, the city pulsed with its usual frenetic energy, a maze of suits and briefcases rushing through concrete canyons. But today, something different caught his eye, a splash of warmth amid the cold steel and glass. At the busy intersection directly below his building, a young woman stood selling candy to passing motorists. Unlike the sea of grim faces around her, she wore a genuine smile that seemed to brighten the entire corner. Henry found himself drawn to his window at the same time each day, watching this curious scene unfold. Her name was Lillian. He'd learned from the cheerful hand-painted sign at her tiny cart. How strange, he mused, adjusting his Italian silk tie, that someone with so little could radiate such joy. As one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs, Henry's world was full of people wearing masks of false sincerity. Every smile he encountered came with an agenda. Every kindness anticipated a return on investment. But this woman, this Lillian, seemed to exist in a different reality altogether. He watched as she interacted with customers, treating each one as if they were the most important person in her world. When cars would honk impatiently, she remained unruffled, her gentle demeanor a stark contrast to the city's harshness. Some days, she would give free candy to children passing by with their parents, her face lighting up at their excitement. "Mr. Mitchell?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 2 p.m. is waiting." Henry sighed, reluctantly turning from the window. "Send them in, Sarah." But throughout his meeting about quarterly projections and market analyses, his mind kept drifting back to the street below. He found himself wondering about her story. What circumstances had brought her to that corner? How did she maintain such genuine warmth in a city that seemed designed to crush the human spirit? The next day, he arrived at work earlier than usual, drawn to his morning ritual of observation. Lillian was already there, carefully arranging her candy display with the same care others might give to precious jewels. A businessman rushed past, accidentally knocking over her carefully organized stand. Henry tensed, expecting the typical New York reaction of anger and harsh words. Instead, Lillian simply laughed, waved off the man's hurried apology, and began rebuilding her display. "That's quite remarkable," Henry whispered to himself, pressing his hand against the cool glass. In his world of corporate takeovers and billion-dollar deals, he'd forgotten such simple grace could exist. For weeks, this continued, the wealthy so secretly watching the humble candy seller from his lofty perch. Each day revealed new facets of her character that left him increasingly intrigued. The way she remembered regular customers' preferences. How? She'd shelter stray cats under her cart during rain. Her small acts of kindness seemed to ripple through the intersection, creating tiny moments of humanity in the urban chaos. But Henry faced a dilemma that grew stronger with each passing day. How could he approach someone like Lillian? His wealth and status would immediately create a barrier. He'd seen it countless times, how people changed when they discovered who he was, what he was worth. The genuine connections he craved always seemed to dissolve in the face of his fortune. Yet something about Lillian suggested she might be different. If only he could find a way to know her without his wealth standing between them. One evening, as the city lights began to twinkle on, Henry watched Lillian pack up her cart for the day. Even after hours of standing in the summer heat, her smile remained as bright as ever. And in that moment, watching her wave goodbye to the hot dog vendor across the street, Henry made a decision. If he wanted to know the real Lillian, to understand the source of her remarkable spirit, he would have to take an extraordinary risk. He would have to become someone else entirely. The plan that formed in his mind was unprecedented, perhaps even foolish for someone in his position. But as he watched Lillian disappear into the crowd, Henry knew he'd do whatever it took to bridge the gap between their worlds. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest risks led to the most precious rewards. And something told him that getting to know Lillian, the real Lillian, would be worth any price he had to pay. That night, in his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Henry paced the polished hardwood floors. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled like scattered diamonds, but his mind was fixed on a simpler light. The warmth of Lillian's smile had somehow pierced the protective shield he'd built around himself over years of success. running his fingers through his perfectly styled hair. Henry caught his reflection in a decorative mirror. Designer suit, luxury watch, every detail crafted to project power and success. A costume in its own right. Perhaps, he murmured to himself, it's time to try on a different kind of disguise. The irony wasn't lost on him. A billionaire planning to masquerade as someone with nothing. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from board members, investors, and social climbers seeking his attention. But for the first time in years, the endless demands of his empire felt hollow compared to the mystery of one street vendor's joy. Henry walked to his vast closet, past rows of tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. At the very back, he found what he was looking for: old clothes he'd kept from his college days, before wealth changed everything. Holding up a worn denim jacket, he remembered a time when genuine connections came more easily. "James," he called to his butler Thrug. The intercom. "Cancel all my morning appointments tomorrow." The slight pause before the response spoke volumes about the unusualness of the request. "Very well, sir. Shall I have the car ready at the usual time?" "No," Henry replied, a small smile playing at his lips. "I think I'll be walking tomorrow." That night, sleep eluded him as he refined his plan, considering every detail. He would need to alter his appearance enough to be unrecognizable, but not so much as to seem threatening. The goal wasn't to deceive, he told himself, but to remove the barriers that wealth inevitably created. As dawn broke over the city, Henry stood before his bathroom mirror, transformation already underway. His perfectly trimmed hair was now deliberately mussed, designer stubble replaced by a few days' worth of real growth. The clothes he chose were clean but worn, nothing that would draw attention or sympathy, just everyday wear. Looking at his reflection, he hardly recognized himself. The power suit persona had vanished completely. For the first time in years, he saw traces of the young man he'd been before success changed everything. His heart raced as he took the service elevator down, avoiding his usual security detail. Walking through the early morning streets, Henry experienced the city differently. No one moved aside for him now. No one offered deferential nods or sycophantic smiles. He was invisible, just another face in the crowd, and the freedom of it was intoxicating. As he approached the familiar intersection, his steps slowed, suddenly unsure of his bold plan. Lillian was already there, arranging her display with characteristic care and cheerfulness. Finding a nearby bench, Henry sat down, his confident demeanor replaced by genuine nervousness. What would he say? How would she react? The stakes felt higher than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. A child's delighted laugh drew his attention back to Lillian's cart. She was kneeling down, helping a small girl choose between different candies while her mother waited patiently. The scene reinforced everything that had drawn him to her. That natural kindness that seemed to flow without effort. Taking a deep breath, Henry stood up. It was time to step into his new role, to take this extraordinary risk. As he approached her cart, Lillian looked up with that same warm smile she offered everyone. "Good morning," she called out, her voice carrying genuine welcome. "Would you like something sweet to start your day?" And in that moment, as their eyes met for the first time, Henry knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about finding something real in a world of carefully crafted illusions. Little did he know, this simple good morning would be the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The city traffic roared around them, but in that moment, everything else seemed to fade away. A new chapter was beginning, written not in boardrooms or on stock tickers, but in the simple space between two hearts. And as Henry prepared to speak his first words to her, he silently prayed that this risk, perhaps the biggest of his life, would lead him to the authentic connection he'd been searching for all along. That first conversation with Lillian was unlike anything Henry had experienced in his carefully controlled world. "I see you here most mornings," he ventured, purposely softening his usually commanding voice. "You always seem to bring such warmth to this corner." Lillian's eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure at the compliment, no trace of the practiced flattery he was used to receiving. "Life's too short to be anything but kind," she replied, arranging colorful candy bars in neat rows. "Besides, everyone fighting their own battles, aren't they?" Henry watched her hands move with practiced efficiency, noticing the slight roughness of her skin, so different from his manicured appearance. Each morning after that, he would find reasons to linger near her cart, gradually building a friendship that felt refreshingly real. She never asked about his circumstances, never showed the pity or judgment he'd feared his disguise might attract. Instead, she treated him with a natural respect that made him increasingly aware of the artificiality of his usual interactions. "Would you like to share my lunch?" she offered one particularly hot day, pulling out a simple sandwich wrapped in paper. The CEO, who regularly dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, found himself touched by this simple act of sharing. They sat together on the nearby bench, watching the endless stream of humanity flow past their quiet corner. "Tell me," Henry asked, careful to maintain his adopted persona, "how do you stay so positive in this crazy city?" Lillian took a thoughtful bite of her sandwich before answering, her eyes distant with reflection. "I believe happiness is a choice we make every day," she said finally. "Even when things are hard, especially when things are hard." Her words struck Henry with unexpected force, making him question his own definitions of success and happiness. As weeks passed, their daily conversations became a cherished ritual, revealing layers of Lillian's character that fascinated him. She spoke of dreams with quiet determination, not of wealth or status, but of making a difference in small, meaningful ways. "Someday," she confided one afternoon, "I'd love to open a little cafe. Nothing fancy, just a place where people feel welcome." The simplicity and sincerity of her ambition touched something deep in Henry's soul. He learned she'd grown up in Queens, raised by a single mother who taught her the value of hard work and kindness. Each detail she shared made him increasingly uncomfortable with his deception, yet terrified of losing this authentic connection. Sometimes, she would share stories about her regular custo. Murs, the harried mother who always needed cheering up, the elderly man who bought candy for his grandchildren. Henry found himself looking forward to these tales more than the high-stakes meetings that filled his other life. In her presence, he felt the weight of his wealth and status fall away, replaced by something lighter, more genuine. But as their friendship deepened, so did his inner conflict about maintaining the charade. He noticed how she sometimes rubbed her shoulders after long hours of standing, how she checked prices carefully when buying her lunch. The power to ease her burdens lay literally in his bank account, yet using it would shatter the precious truth they'd built. One rainy afternoon, as they huddled under the awning of her cart, Lillian revealed a vulnerability that caught him off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted softly, "I wonder if I'm foolish, holding on to these dreams when reality keeps pushing back." Henry's heart ached with the desire to tell her everything, to show her that her dreams were within reach. Instead, he found himself saying, "Dreams aren't foolish if they come from the heart. They're what make us human." She smiled at him then, a smile so full of trust and friendship that it made his careful disguise feel like a betrayal. As thunder rolled overhead, Henry realized he was falling in love not with an idea or an image, but with the genuine soul beside him. Yet every step closer to her heart led him deeper into a web of necessary lies that threatened to unravel at any moment. Walking home that evening through the rain, his designer shoes hidden under scuffed boots, Henry faced an impossible choice. How long could he maintain this double life? When would the right moment come to reveal his true identity? The lights of his penthouse beckoned in the distance, but his thoughts remained with the woman who had shown him what true wealth looked like. In the growing darkness, Henry understood that his carefully planned experiment in authenticity had become something far more complicated. He was no longer just seeking truth. He was falling in love with it, even as his own lies threatened to destroy everything. The city night enveloped him, offering no answers, only the echo of Lillian's honest laughter and the weight of his growing deception. Tomorrow would bring another day of choices, another chance to either deepen the lie or risk losing the most real thing he'd ever known. And in his heart, Henry knew that sooner or later, truth would demand its price, changing both their lives forever. The autumn evening painted Manhattan in shades of gold and shadow when Henry first discovered Lillian's other life. He hadn't planned to follow her that night, but a glimpse of her familiar figure hurrying down an unfamiliar street caught his attention. Gone was her usual confident stride, replaced by something more hesitant, almost furtive in the growing darkness. Something's wrong, he thought, his protective instincts overriding his usual respect for her privacy. The neighborhood changed as they walked, glass towers giving way to weathered brick buildings and flickering neon signs. When Lillian stopped in front of a dingy bar called the Blue Moon, Henry's heart sank with a mixture of concern and confusion. Through the grimy windows, he watched as she disappeared inside, emerging moments later wearing a waitress uniform. The scene that unfolded before him was far from the cheerful morning interactions he'd come to know. Inside, Lillian moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her bright smile now replaced by a careful neutrality. "Hey, sweetheart, how about a smile?" a patron called out, his voice carrying the slur of too many drinks. Henry's fists clenched involuntarily as he watched Lillian navigate the unwanted attention with quiet dignity. Hour after hour, she endured casual disrespect and thinly veiled harassment, maintaining her composure through it all. This is why she sometimes looks so tired in the mornings, Henry realized, his chest tight with understanding. The wealthy businessman who could buy and sell this entire block stood helpless in the shadows, watching her struggle. Near midnight, a more aggressive customer grabbed Lillian's arm, pulling her closer as she tried to serve drinks. Before Henry could intervene, she handled the situation with a firm but professional response that diffused the tension. Yet he saw the slight tremor in her hands as she retreated behind the bar, the momentary crack in her carefully maintained facade. Just 2 more hours, he heard her whisper to herself, straightening her shoulders with determination. When her shift finally ended at 2 a.m., Henry followed at a distance, his heart heavy with newfound knowledge. The city streets were nearly empty now, their earlier golden glow replaced by harsh streetlight shadows. Lillian's path led to a modest apartment building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Through a ground-floor window, Henry witnessed a scene that finally completed the puzzle. An elderly woman lay in a hospital-style bed, medical equipment crowding the small room. Lillian's mother. It had to be, and suddenly everything made terrible, beautiful sense. With infinite tenderness, Lillian helped her mother take evening medications, whispering soft encouragement. Then, from a locked drawer, she withdrew a thick envelope, carefully counting out bills and making notes in a worn notebook. The surgery fund, Henry realized, understanding at last the weight of responsibility that drove her double life. Each dollar represented hours of enduring disrespect and exhaustion, all for the love of her mother. The discovery left Henry standing in the darkness, tears threatening to break through his carefully maintained control. Here was a woman who worked 2 jobs, faced daily hardships, yet never lost her capacity for kindness. In his world of corporate power plays and million-dollar deals, he'd forgotten such pure sacrifice was possible. The stark contrast between Lillian's morning warmth and nightly struggle spoke of a strength he could barely comprehend. As he walked back to his luxury apartment, Henry's mind raced with possibilities for helping her. His wealth could solve her problems instantly. One phone call could change everything. But would such intervention destroy the genuine connection they'd built? Would it feel like charity rather than care? The city lights blurred through his tears as he wrestled with the complexity of their situation. In trying to discover Lillian's true nature, he'd found something far more precious and far more complicated. She wasn't just the sunny candy seller or the stoic waitress. She was both, and so much more. Her dual life wasn't a deception like his, but a testament to the lengths one would go for love. Dawn was breaking as Henry finally reached his building, his heart heavy with admiration and guilt. He had sought authentic connection by hiding his wealth, only to discover that true richness lay in sacrifice and love. The question now was, how could he help Lillian without destroying the trust they'd built on his own carefully constructed lies? As he watched the sunrise paint the city in new light, Henry knew that soon he would have to make a choice. Between truth and deception, between help and respect, between love and fear. Everything hung in the balance. And somewhere in the city, Lillian was probably already setting up her candy cart, ready to face another day with grace. The thought of her quiet strength made his own deception feel suddenly unbearable. Truth would have its day, But first, he needed to find a way to bridge the gulf between their worlds without breaking what they'd built. The morning Henry decided to reveal his true identity dawned with an unusual stillness over Manhattan. His hands trembled slightly as he dressed in his usual expensive suit, each movement weighted with the knowledge of what was to come. The familiar corner where Lillian's cart stood seemed different today, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. "Good morning," Lillian called out cheerfully, not yet noticing anything amiss about her regular morning visitor. Her smile, so pure and genuine, made Henry's heart constrict with the pain of what he was about to do. "Lillian," he began, his voice carrying its natural authority for the first time since they'd met. "We need to talk." Something in his tone made her pause, the candy bar in her hand frozen mid-arrangement as she truly looked at him. Confusion flickered across her face as she took in his transformed appearance. The designer suit, the perfectly groomed hair. "I haven't been honest with you," Henry continued, fighting to maintain eye contact. "My name is Henry Mitchell." Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by disbelief, then a deep, crushing hurt that tore at his soul. "The Henry Mitchell? The CEO?" Her voice was barely a whisper, each word carrying the weight of betrayal. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, but in that moment, they might as well have been alone in the universe. "Yes," he admitted, watching as the trust they'd built crumbled before his eyes. "I wanted to know you without my wealth standing between us." Lillian took a step back, her hands gripping the edge of her cart as if to steady herself. "All this time," she said, her voice trembling, "every conversation, every shared moment, it was all based on a lie." The hurt in her eyes was worse than any business loss he'd ever faced, any financial crisis he'd weathered. "The feelings were real, Lillian. Everything I shared with you about who I am inside, that was all true." But she was already shaking her head, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "How can I believe anything you say now? Was I just some kind of social experiment to you?" The bitterness in her voice cut through him like a blade, all the more painful because he knew he deserved it. "No, Lillian, you were never an experiment. You showed me what real kindness looks like, what genuine strength truly means." He took a step forward, but she raised her hand to stop him, creating an invisible barrier between them. "I know about the bar," he continued softly. "About your mother. I want to help. I can help." The color drained from her face at his words, replaced by a mix of shame and anger. "You followed me? Spied on my life." Each word was sharp with betrayal. "And now you think throwing money at it will make everything okay." Around them, morning commuters began to slow, drawn by the unfolding drama at the usually peaceful corner. "Please," Henry said, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "Let me explain." But Lillian was already packing up her cart, her movements quick and jerky with suppressed emotion. "I don't want your explanations, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her formal tone a knife to his heart. "And I definitely don't want your money." The woman who had never turned anyone away was now turning her back on him, wheels of her cart squeaking against the pavement. "Lillian, wait," he called after her, but she didn't look back, her small figure quickly swallowed by the morning crowd. Henry stood alone on the corner where they'd shared so many moments, feeling the full weight of his choices. In trying to find something real, he had broken something precious beyond repair. The autumn breeze carried away the last echoes of her retreating footsteps, leaving only the hollow ache of loss. Above him, his office window gleamed in the morning sun, but its heights had never felt more lonely, more meaningless. He had gained the truth at the cost of everything that mattered, and the price felt impossibly high. In the days that followed their confrontation, Henry's world lost its color, even as autumn painted the city in brilliant hues. His penthouse, once a symbol of success, now felt like a gilded cage, every luxury a mockery of what he'd lost. "Will Miss Thompson be joining you for lunch today?" his assistant asked, still unaware of how drastically things had changed. "No, Sarah," he replied softly, his eyes drawn to the empty corner below. "She won't be joining me anymore." Yet even in their separation, Henry couldn't stop himself from watching over Lillian from afar. He noticed how she'd moved her car to a different corner, further from his building, as if trying to erase their shared history. The shadows under her eyes grew darker, testament to her continuing double life of daily sacrifice. Each night, he found himself driving past the blue moon, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The sight of her enduring casual disrespect night after night became unbearable, a constant reminder of his powerlessness. There has to be a way, he whispered to himself one evening, watching her dodge another drunk patron's advances. In his office, Henry made countless calls, pulling strings he'd never thought he'd use for something so personal. The finest medical specialists in the city were contacted, arrangements made in absolute secrecy. Everything must be anonymous, he insisted to his private secretary. She can never know it came from me. Within days, Lillian's mother received a mysterious call from a prestigious hospital about a new treatment program. All expenses would be covered by an anonymous benefactor, they explained, a miracle wrapped in discretion. Henry watched from the shadows as Lillian helped her mother into the hospital, hope brightening her tired features. The surgery was scheduled quickly, performed by the city's top specialists, every detail managed with careful precision. Each night, during her mother's recovery, Henry sat in his car outside the hospital, a silent guardian in the darkness. He saw Lillian leaving late one evening, tears streaming down her face, but this time, they were tears of joy. The surgery had been successful. Her mother would recover. The burden she'd carried for so long was finally lifting. Through his network of quiet influence, Henry ensured she no longer needed to work at the Blue Moon. A mysterious benefactor had paid off the medical bills, leaving her free to focus on her daytime work and her mother's recovery. Sometimes, walking the city streets in his expensive suits, he would catch glimpses of her at her candy cart. Her smile seemed lighter now, unburdened by the weight of nightly struggles and mounting medical bills. Yet each time their paths nearly crossed, she would turn away, the hurt still fresh, the betrayal still raw. Henry accepted this distance as his penance, finding solace in knowing she was free from her heaviest burdens. Is this what love is? He wondered late one night, starry, at the city lights, helping from afar, expecting nothing in return. His wealth had always been a tool for acquiring what he wanted, but now it served a different purpose. For the first time in his life, Henry understood that true power lay not in possession, but in the ability to give without recognition. Each morning, he still watched from his window as she set up her cart, though now blocks away from his building. Her kindness remained unchanged, her spirit undiminished. If anything, it seemed to shine brighter than before. And though the distance between them felt infinite, Henry found a bittersweet peace in his role as her unseen protector. Perhaps, he thought, this was his way of proving that his love had been real, even if built on a foundation of deception. In the end, it wasn't about redemption or forgiveness. It was simply about ensuring her happiness, whatever the cost to his own. The city continued its endless rhythm, unknowing witness to this tale of love transformed into silent guardianship. And somewhere in its crowded streets, two hearts beat in separate rhythms, one still wounded, one learning to love differently. Sometimes, love means letting go, Henry realized. Sometimes, it means becoming the invisible hand that lightens another's load. And so he watched and waited and hoped, not for forgiveness, but for the day when her smile would be completely free of shadows. The first snowfall of winter dusted Manhattan in crystalline white when Lillian finally reached out to Henry. Her message was simple, a request to meet at the park where they had shared so many conversations in his disguised days. Henry's hands trembled as he read the text, hope and fear warring in his chest like caged birds seeking release. The park looked different in winter's embrace, their usual bench now wearing a delicate blanket of pristine snow. Lillian was already there when he arrived, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp December air. She wore the same worn blue coat he remembered, but something about her seemed changed, lighter somehow. "My mother asked about you," she began without preamble, her voice soft but steady. She wanted to thank her mysterious benefactor. Henry stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment between them. "I know it was you, Henry. All of it, the surgery, the hospital, the bills, even the changes at the bar before I left." Her eyes met his, and he saw in them a complexity of emotions that made his heart ache with both hope and regret. "I wanted to hate you," she continued, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the snow beside her. For lying, for following me, for thinking money could fix everything. Henry remained silent, understanding that this was her moment to speak, to unburden herself of months of conflicted feelings. But then I watched my mother grow stronger each day. I saw her smile again, really smile, for the first time in years. A snowflake landed on her cheek, melting instantly like a tear that she quickly brushed away. And I realized something that scared me more than your lies ever did. I missed you, the real you, beneath all the pretense. Her words hung in the winter air between them, delicate as the falling snow, profound as an avalanche. The man who sat with me during lunch breaks, who listened to my dreams without judgment, who saw me as more than just a candy seller. Henry took a careful step forward, his expensive shoes crunching in the fresh snow. That was always the real me, Lillian. She nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I believe that now. It just took me time to understand. I never meant to hurt you, Henry said softly. I just didn't know how else to bridge the gap between our worlds. Lillian stood up, brushing snow from her coat. Maybe there never needed to be a gap at all. Maybe we create these divisions ourselves. The park had grown quieter, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold between them. I'm not asking for things to go back to how they were, Henry ventured carefully. I just want a chance to start again. Honestly this time. Lillian took a step toward him, closing the physical distance that had symbolized so much more. I'd like that, she said simply, and in those 3 words, Henry heard the possibility of redemption. They began walking together through the snowy park, their footprints marking a new path forward. Tell me about your mother, Henry said gently. How is she really doing? And so Lillian began to share, not just the medical updates, but the small victories and quiet moments of recovery. As they walked and talked, the walls between their worlds seemed to dissolve like snowflakes on warm skin. Their conversation flowed naturally, as if the months of separation had been nothing more than a pause between sentences. Yet there was something different now, a depth born of pain and forgiveness, a strength forged in the fire of truth. Henry realized that while his deception had caused deep hurt, it had also cleared the way for something more authentic. They had both been transformed by their time apart. He learning the true meaning of selfless love, she discovering her own capacity for forgiveness. As evening approached and the park lights began to twinkle through the falling snow, they found themselves back at their bench. Would you like to get coffee? Henry asked, hope making his voice slightly uncertain. I know a small place nearby. Lillian smiled, and in that smile was the promise of new beginnings. I'd love to, Henry. Just be yourself this time. Together they walked out of the park, leaving their footprints in the snow, separate tracks that gradually merged into a single path forward. Behind them, the bench where their story had begun slowly disappeared under fresh snow, nature's way of marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The city continued its eternal dance around them, but in that moment, they had found their own rhythm, one built on truth, forgiveness, and the possibility of love reborn. The spring sun cast golden light across Manhattan as Henry and Lillian stood before a small storefront in Greenwich Village. It's perfect, Lillian whispered, her hand pressed against the dusty window of what would soon become her cafe. Henry watched her face illuminate with joy, finding more beauty in her excitement than in any luxury he'd ever owned. Are you sure about this? He asked softly, not questioning her dream, but offering one last chance to reconsider. She turned to him, her eyes sparkling with a mix of determination and grateful love that made his heart skip. I've never been more sure of anything, she replied, squeezing his hand. Except maybe you. The transformation of the old bookstore into Lillian's dream cafe became their shared project, a labor of love and healing. Each decision was made together, from the warm wood tables to the carefully chosen local artwork adorning the walls. No marble countertops, Lillian insisted with a laugh. I want people to feel at home here, not intimidated. Henry found himself learning to see the world through her eyes, where value wasn't measured in dollars, but in human connection. They spent weekends picking out mismatched vintage chairs, each with its own story, its own character. Just like the people who'll sit in them, Lillian explained, running her hand along a worn leather armchair. Her mother, now fully recovered, helped choose the perfect spot for a community bulletin board near the entrance. Every neighborhood needs a heart, she said wisely, a place where stories can be shared and dreams can grow. As opening day approached, Henry watched Lillian transform from the tired candy seller into a radiant business owner. She insisted on hiring local staff, including some regulars from her old corner who needed a fresh start. Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild, she said, and Henry heard in her words the echo of their own story. The morning of the grand opening, Henry arrived early to find Lillian already there, arranging fresh flowers on each table. Sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows, catching the gold letters on the front window. Corner of Joy Cafe. Named after where we met, she explained, blushing slightly. Where everything changed. The cafe quickly became more than just a business. It became a sanctuary of warmth in the city's endless rush. Lillian knew every regular customer's name, just as she had known every faithful candy buyer from her cart days. She created a pay-it-forward board where customers could pre-purchase coffee and meals for those who couldn't afford them. Henry, watching her in her element, realized that true wealth wasn't in his bank accounts, but in moments like these. In the queue, at hours after closing, they would often sit together in the window seat, planning and dreaming. I want to open more locations, Lillian shared one evening, her head resting on his shoulder. Not for profit, but for purpose. Henry smiled, understanding now that her kind of ambition was rarer and more precious than any corporate takeover. We'll do it together, he promised, kissing her temple. Your vision, my resources, imagine what we could build. Their lives had found a beautiful balance, his world of high finance blending with her world of simple, profound connections. She taught him to see the extraordinary in ordinary moments. He helped her expand the reach of her natural generosity. Together, they were creating something neither could have imagined alone, a legacy of kindness in an often harsh city. The Corner of Joy became known as a place where CEOs and street vendors sat side by side, sharing humanity over coffee. It was living proof that when hearts align, the barriers between worlds can dissolve like sugar in a warm cup of care. And every morning, as they opened the cafe together, Henry and Lillian exchanged knowing smiles, grateful for the lies that led to truth. For sometimes, they had learned, love takes unexpected detours on its way to finding home. In their case, it had taken a disguise, a revelation, forgiveness, and finally, a shared dream to build their corner of joy. And that, they both agreed, was worth every step of the journey.